So let's go back here. All right. The times that try men's souls. I have it as the title of the lecture here because it's a line from, again, Thomas Paine's second pamphlet that's very in 1776. Again, we can't always kind of synchronize the political with the military developments, but just cast your memory back a little bit and understand that we haven't declared independence yet at the start of this story. It's the aftermath of the Boston campaign. There were celebrations galore. Obviously, with the British evacuating, they believed, rightfully so, it was a great victory. Not really a battle. The British just kind of up and left. You can't really call it a battle if no shots have been fired, but there is a overall consensus that the mettle and toughness of the Continental Army was on display, and certainly the genius of George Washington as commander. Okay, the only problem is the Army is not as continental as Washington and Congress and maybe the soldiers themselves would like. It's 90% New England. Another problem is it's not much of an army at all. So the Continental Army, to borrow from an old Saturday Night Live skit, is neither continental nor an army. Discuss amongst yourselves. Just look that reference up if you want to. The army marching behind Washington might charitably be called a work in progress. I think that's an accurate synopsis of the Continental Army. There were militia units swarming around Boston ever since April of 1775 and the shots that were fired at Lexington and Concord. This was the force incorporated into the army. Everyone who descended on Boston after the fabled shot heard around the world as they surrounded the British forces inside Boston. But it's also changing. Yes, it's made up of New England volunteers. It is not so much a Continental Army or even much of an army, but most of the yeoman farmers who first came out after Concord went home. They have jobs, families, they're tending fields. 95% of them are in farming of some capacity. And they're not really determined to be a part of this long campaign against the British. What's left over are former indentures, Irish immigrants, unemployed artisans, blacksmiths, and people who think, well, maybe the army is a better future for me. Yeah. I might get paid, get a bonus if I stay on, maybe a promise of land. The makeup of the Continental Army, Washington is never satisfied with the soldiery or the officers, but you know what? This is an American army. It's not, and you cannot have the same expectations of a European-style army. To quote one historian, as I say these things somewhat better than I can, what Washington called the soldiery of the Continental Army was a motley crew of marginal men and misfits, most wearing hunting shirts instead of uniforms, spitting tobacco every few paces when they marched, all defiantly confident that they had just humiliated the flower of the British Army at Boston and would do the same at New York. That's a little harsh, marginal men and misfits. One historian has noted that the Norman Rockwell period of the war is over. The rage militaire, as one of my mentors at LSU called it. The idea of personal sacrifice, it's a French term meaning military rage, and this patriotic enthusiasm for going out and sustaining in the Continental Army. That'll fade, and Washington knew it. What next? The military struggle was not going to be a short conflict won by a burst of American patriotism. You were going to have to slog it out with the British. It's a protracted war. Washington feared that's what it would actually take. Some people thought, nah, England would see the error of their ways. Again, that was the hope really in the spring of 1776, right? This is an army, a Continental Army now, with Washington in charge, that would fight a defensive war until the British changed their minds and restore things the way they would be in 1763. Only that really wasn't to be. So a protracted war was going to test the capacity for the nation and the soldiers and the officers to endure for years. War lasts 8 years. 8 years. Even after the fighting stops, the war is still going on because it hadn't ended. You know, the last battle, which we traditionally call Yorktown, it's 2 years before the New York. So you don't fight battles, but you got to keep the army around. It's some of the toughest years of the war. You think, oh, fighting is tough. Yeah, it is. It's horrible. It's bloody, and it's, we found out, very personal. Seeing the whites of their eyes, that's just good advice. That's how you can probably hope to hit somebody. And then after you unload the musket, you try to stab and kill them with a bayonet. It's a personal. You see this happening. Again, it's not pushing buttons and drones and missiles and tanks and airplanes. It is, again, gritty and ugly. The general in charge of the Army said it best. He's optimistic, he has to be. I have often thought, and this is Washington expressing his logistical challenges. I've often thought how much happier I should be if, instead of accepting a command under such circumstances, I should have taken my musket upon my shoulder and entered the ranks, or had retired to the back country and lived in a wigwam. That's George Washington in 1776. Again, confident in his abilities, but then understanding the challenge that's going to be involved. Washington can opt for, and here's where we integrate the notes with the background story. He has 3 options of how to fight the American Revolution. American Revolution and the Revolutionary War. 2 things are happening, right? The Revolutionary War, the American Revolution. Yeah. So now we're moving on to the military campaigns to secure the revolution, or whatever's going to happen, because we're still, again, I know we got to independence last time, but we still have to talk about the New York campaign in all of this. 3 options for taking the army into the battle against the British. Number 1, take the army over the Allegheny Mountains and fight a guerrilla war. Just dare the British to find him, attack him, disappear. Okay, that's one option. Number 2, fight what's called a war of posts, tactical engagements, by which you pick and choose where you fight, you retreat, but just drag it out. Stretch the British supply lines. Make them frustrated enough that they stop fighting. 3rd, engage the British Army. Go to battle with them. And hope for another series of Bunker Hill-style battles. That's what some of Washington's officers, again, the New Englanders, who were like, well, yeah, we'll just do this every time. And Washington says, yeah, it's not going to be that easy, because this is not another group of American militia we're fighting. This is the British Army. They're pretty good. The first option, Washington considers not to be one at all. It allows the British Army to operate at will and take out the militia in the different states, target Congress, maybe arrest those so-called ringleaders, and have them swinging from the business end of a rope. Number 2, the second option, has appeal, but it also strikes Washington as cowardice. Retreat, pick where you fight, turn, and attack the British. It would also, he understands, ruin his reputation, and reputation is everything to Washington. This letter I read where he said, "I just as soon pick up a musket or live out west in a wigwam," this isn't published, obviously, during the American Revolution. He's writing home to his friends and family, you know, in a confessional style. Oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? Things don't look good. And when you're really low emotionally, you write things like that, only to be published later on. I think it's great that they were saved. Not all of his letters were saved. His letters to his wife were not saved. Oh my, that would have been a treasure trove of information. That would have humanized the man on the monument a hell of a lot more. Right. And the back and forth letters, that would have been something. But again, I respect the decision. He knew that generations later we're going to have to deal with him some way, and this is a side of him that I think he would say, you can't have it. You don't get to see. And so it's understood, the personal side. Again, we would have loved to, just as historians, to get further window into. And I can tell you during research, when you have blanks of months or years, when you're looking at an event or a person, it frustrates the heck out of you. You just wish you had that, that letter that said, why did I take this side in the American, we're fighting with the rebellion, or you're fighting against the rebellion. Where's that letter that says why you made that decision? It doesn't always exist, and you just have to say, okay, we'll just go without it and go from there. Okay, so the three options. We talked about the second one. Washington isn't big on that. It also meant, the War of Post, that you would end up conceding without defending them, meaning give them to the British. Philadelphia and New York. And it would also, this War of Post, embolden the loyalists, who are a considerable amount of the population, to come out and maybe wage war against their fellow citizens based on their politics. Well, the people who were supporting the rebellion were doing a pretty good job making life pretty miserable for the loyalists, turning them in, watching them, squelching their free speech. Yeah. No mass executions or hangings like in other rebellions, but, nevertheless, the kind of civil liberties that the American rebels always said were being infringed upon the English, they had to go do the same to their loyalist or Tory neighbors. Okay, the third option is what he decided to do at first. Punish the British Army and show that they are overconfident. It's going to fail miserably in New York. There's no question among anyone who commands the sea. The Royal Navy commands the water like anyone else in the world. New York is an archipelago, folks. It's a series of islands. If you're not familiar with it, I have a slide or two. I have multiple slides. Defend it because Congress says you have to defend New York because that's where the British are redeploying. Nathaniel Greene said burn the city. And Washington thought, no, and later regretted it. And then about a third of Manhattan is actually torched by either the retreating Continental Army or loyalists. Were unsure, and they'll point fingers at each other in the aftermath. And of course, the British will occupy New York successfully. So in late spring of 1776, we've got day laborers, slaves confiscated by the Continental Army. Soldiers turn the whole area into an armed camp. That's what it becomes. So the army is dispersed. He's got soldiers in Manhattan. He's got soldiers in Long Island. They're trying to restrict the British Navy's movement with defensive positions on Long Island and Manhattan. Brooklyn Heights on Long Island, the northwestern corner of Long Island, turns into a honeycomb of forts, redoubts, and trenches, which are basically they're sand and dirt just piled up that will embolden the soldiers to stand behind it. It is, as one historian said, Bunker Hill on steroids. Bunker Hill was, of course, really quickly throwing up fortifications, and not a fort. I just mean the ability to dig a trench, put your musket above the trench, maybe again stand there and fire and go back down and reload, and that's going to let soldiers stay in their place, hopefully, for quite a while. Washington traveled to Philadelphia in early June 1776, and he confers with members of Congress. Remember, he's taking orders from Congress about New York. He meets the chairman of the Board of War, John Adams. What is the chairman of the Board of War? It's kind of like a Secretary of War for the Congress. It's one of the many committees John Adams says he's on, and that preoccupies him so much he can't even bother to think about or consider writing a draft of the Declaration of Independence. So anyway, like Washington, it is Adams who says, I'm unworthy of this job. Nothing in my background even gives me any experience to prepare him for this. He asked friends in Boston, search the bookshelves of bookstores for sources on how to run an army. What could possibly go wrong? Let me give you a synopsis of what's happening. So, the famous segue, an array of amateur soldiers and officers was now being supervised by a civilian with no military experience. Here we go. New York campaign, 1776. Abandoning the area was out of the question. Should have been really what Washington did. Think of the timing, and that's probably why Washington dug in around New York. Think of the timing. Lee's resolution. So let's put together the military situation with the political situation. Lee's resolution of June 1776 that these colonies are henceforth and forever free, breaking ties from Great Britain, you know how it went, is before Congress. They're delaying the vote so that the vote is strongly in support, and they're also waiting for that committee of 5 to draft the Declaration. How would it look with the political climax of the debate for the Army to say, you know what, let's just go to the hills of Connecticut and hang out there and not fight? It wouldn't look very good. You can't look militarily weak and vulnerable when independence is about to possibly happen, and increasingly it looks like it will happen. Of course, the celebration of independence happening will be short-lived if the Continental Army is annihilated in New York. No one asked that question. Would it look a lot worse if the Army is piecemeal destroyed instead of going into the hills of Connecticut? And how are you going to get New York, right, to support independence? They abstain, we know, 12-4, none against, one abstain, because of what's happening with the developments. The spies for weeks and months knew that the British Army left Boston, went back to Halifax, got reinforcements, and all indications are they're heading towards New York. On June 28th, the day, the Committee of 5 present the Declaration to Congress. The first wave of the fleet shows up in the waters of New York, carrying with it General William Howe, guy is no slouch, and 9,000 British soldiers, the first wave of many that will follow. They are sighted off Long Island. They move to the British to Staten Island. There's no opposition there by the Continental Army. They're deployed along the heights of Manhattan, Manhattan itself, and of course, Long Island. The troops will disembark, the British troops, there on July 2nd, the day that Congress votes for independence. So there's the timing, everybody, big picture timing. They're landing on Staten Island, south of Manhattan, and just west of Long Island, the day that Congress makes the vote. Then Howe waits. He waits for his brother, Admiral Howe. So you've got William Howe, his brother, the admiral, is Richard Howe. The Howe brothers, and there have been books written about them. No, it's not a comedy troupe. It's 2 very qualified British officers with more reinforcements to arrive. This is the problem with the Howes, though, and the Howes' instructions. They are there, part of their mission is to offer peace negotiations with representatives of Congress and the Continental Army. This is a mixed message, right? The Howe has to carry out battle against the Continental Army, but not the annihilation of the Continental Army, and still offer mediation on behalf of the King of England to end the rebellion. It's difficult, right? You're a military man and you're caught in this tough position. It's a mixed message. It's a decidedly mixed message. The idea that you are there to prosecute an end to this rebellion. There's talk about amnesty. You know, all things will be forgiven. Just take that oath to king and country once again. Yeah. So again, this is why, and we'll see this play out really in Howe's conduct of the New York campaign when we get into August and September of 1776. Washington has an army that a quarter of them are stricken with smallpox. Inoculations were only starting to take place. Here's another subject of recent scholarship that has come to light as far as the importance of the Continental Army and life in the colonies in 1776. There is a smallpox epidemic in the American colonies in 1776 and 1777. Folks down here understand the importance of it. It annihilates the caddo. It really does damage to the Indians in this area. and it did also to those who didn't go through and get the inoculation, which are controversial. But Washington decides he's going to put part of his army aside, have them get the inoculation. You'll recover or die, but mostly you'll recover if you're healthy, and then you'll be able to fight that off. So Washington is stubborn when he sees these soldiers deploy. Here's his quote: "If our troops will behave well, having everything to contend for that free men hold dear, the British will have to wade through much blood and slaughter before they can carry any part of our works, if they carry them at all." Washington, we think around July 8th, reads the Declaration of Independence to the Army. Now the Army has a purpose. Continental Army does what? It exists. Now it is fighting for independence. This is the army that's going to secure the promise in the Declaration. But appeals to the cause, as it's often called, put in quotes the cause, dire warnings about becoming slaves, as Washington said. We'll submit or become enslaved. From a slave owner. Interesting quote. It's not the problem. Words cannot help hold an indefensible position or mask the fact that Washington puts the troops in poor positions around Staten Island. In early July, the Army prepared for the blow that they know was coming. Washington makes a series of errors. Let's go back to the map, shall we, without disconnecting the call, hopefully. Technology, here we go. Okay, Battle of Long Island, here it is. And I'm big on maps because, you have to see what we're talking about here to understand it. There's Staten Island, so you see Howe is commanding of 30,000 soldiers. There's New York, only about 1 square mile. New York, about 1 square mile of the island is occupied. Now it's a thriving metropolis, 8 million plus people, maybe even more. Okay, and now, of course, we know that New York is connected. You've got multiple bridges in the east side of New York to Brooklyn area right here. So the British will land at Graveshead, and this is the battle, so you can't see maybe the dispositions as much. But Washington along the heights here, and yes, there are rolling hills there. There are still forests in New York City, the actual Manhattan Island. Again, just part of the island occupied and actually developed. Okay, a string of blunders follow for Washington. He makes a lot of errors. He makes the errors, Washington. He sends a substantial group of horse soldiers, cavalry, back to Connecticut, not needed. So, in some ways, when you read about it, it kind of mirrors the mistakes like Custer. No, we don't need Gatling guns. Nah, we don't need sabers against the Indians. There's just a small, and he meets his little bighorn. Well, this isn't quite as bad and destructive, but nevertheless, the errors are there. He divided his force in front of a superior force, something you never ever do. Folks, if you pick up a book called How to Be a General for Dummies or The Idiot's Guide to Generaling, page 1, never divide your force in front of a larger force because it will invite you to be destroyed piecemeal. The army will go after one section, destroy the other, and you're done. Washington did it. Anyway, he has to do it throughout the Revolution. Most of the American commanders do throw out the playbook. Campaign in winter, campaign at night, attack posts that may be strongly defended. Again, okay, half of his forces, Washington's forces, are in Manhattan. Half of them are on Long Island. He's not exactly sure at first where Howe is going to deploy. So that's why. I mean, he's got, if you look at the map, maybe 10, 12,000 on actual Long Island itself. The Washington 20,000 is probably the entire Continental Army in the area. So he splits that force, which is now smaller because you keep half of them there in New York Island and then half of them in Long Island. So when the British finally move, it is late August. They land 15,000 soldiers near the villages of Brooklyn, which is, again, an anglicized word of Brookline or Brookloin or whatever the Dutch called it when it was part of the Dutch colony. And that is exactly what happened. Washington puts his troops, this area is known as the Gowanus Heights to this day, the Gowanus Heights area of western Long Island, or the Heights of Gowan, as they call them. It was a defensible position. Sorry, unfortunately, Washington left open what would be called his left flank. Again, if you're standing in Washington's lines out to the left, there is a road that several loyalists tell the British about. You just go out to that road and then turn back the other way, and you'll completely roll up Washington's left side, which is near, you can see it here, near the village of Bedford. And it's not even defended. In fact, it's defended by basically 4 officers. I was reading about the Battle of New York, and you got 4 guys there watching the road thinking, oh, fill in the blank, it's the whole British Army kind of turning our whole flank over, and that's what happens. The British create a diversion in the front. Again, make them think, the American Continental Army, that all the attacks are going to come along here and then just move the whole army. You can see it right here. They just take a good portion of their force all the way around and attack with some of their more aggressive officers. Washington put his troops in a situation that they could be defeated in detail. And then the British would employ the British Navy, and then it is essentially game over. Asked to explain the whole army getting rolled up and then basically holding out right here, the northern extension of Long Island, closest to Manhattan. John Adams says, and this is the quote about the New York campaign, in general, our generals were out-generaled. Well, there you go. Abigail Adams then reminded her husband that the men were all killed or captured. The British would then face an army of armed and angry Amazon women. And letters, John and Abigail. There's a correspondence that not all of it was destroyed. And it's fantastic, the Abigail Adams and John Adams exchange. As Abigail tells John, right, in your new laws, creation of new laws, don't forget the ladies. And John Adams basically lectures, or what's the modern term I'm hearing? Mansplains to Abigail, saying we would never think of overturning our manly institutions. And Abigail says, I hope you like the couch, because it literally is a reference to, okay, you know, this reflects the opportunity that people see in the revolution. And why wouldn't you think that when you have all new people participating in politics? Why would that not include women? Why would that not include people who didn't own property? Why would not that open up the possibility of limiting or ending slavery? Begging the question, how revolutionary was the American Revolution? The only high point of the campaign is the retreat of the army off of Long Island. The only comparison I can make, Dunkirk, where the British and French forces are literally trapped on the tip of Europe with the Third Reich, the army, the Wehrmacht, the British army, descending on them. A dramatic escape has to happen, just like at Dunkirk. Just like at Dunkirk. Howe then hesitates. Look, folks, this is what the army is right here. The army on Long Island is trapped right here. Unless they can swim, there ain't no bridges. Brooklyn Bridge, George Washington Bridge, the East River Bridge, they haven't been built yet and won't be for another 100+ years. So that leaves the army right there, and Howe hesitates. This is Howe thinking, what do I do next? Any other aggressive British commander would have said, attack, go after them and push them into the water. Instead, Washington employs New England fishermen, John Glover's Marblehead Marines, they were called. This is somebody who, man, he saves Washington's bacon multiple times during the American Revolution. They evacuate Long Island to Manhattan. There is rain, followed by what Washington will later describe as a providential fog. A fog sets in that is so thick, pea soup thick, it covers the retreat as the boats then take the army off of Long Island onto Manhattan. Washington is on the last boat that evacuates the army on August 29, 1776. His army, his generals, Washington's generals, beseech him to give up Manhattan. He stays committed to the idea that I was supposed to defend it. That's what Congress wants them to do. So the Royal Navy just floats up the East River ahead of Washington's army running up of Manhattan in desperate high-speed retreat. It's a foot race to keep the army from getting cut up and annihilated at Manhattan. As it turns out, Washington defends a city that he doesn't have to. Congress tells him, you don't have to defend New York anymore. And so Washington thinks, well, I'm going to make some kind of show of it here. So more and more, he relies on a second strategy, which is the War of Posts. You can see what Washington is going to do is build a series of forts. Some are on the New Jersey side here, you can see in the map, and one is up near the village of Harlem, Fort Lee and Fort Washington, and he keeps the soldiers there, even though most of them have actually abandoned Manhattan itself. So Washington is relying on that second. He tried the first strategy, meet them in open battle. Didn't work. Didn't work at all. Second strategy, the War of Posts. Watch his troops leave Fort Lee, and he's watching them also. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself here. He occupies Fort Lee and Fort Washington, two forts where he's going to keep soldiers, and the generals there say, yeah, keep the soldiers there. It's not like they're vulnerable or anything. They're very, very vulnerable. These posts along the river between New Jersey and New York also fall. Fort Washington is abandoned by some soldiers, others stay, but the British force Washington to, again, surrender the fort. He's not there, of course, but Fort Washington falls. There are 3,000 soldiers who also are affected by that surrender. Washington, it said, weeps when he sees the fortress of Fort Washington having to fall to the British. He should not have held on to it. It was a major mistake. One individual who was captured in the retreat across New York is Nathan Hale. One of the books I didn't highlight, but here it is. The Martyr and the Traitor, Nathan Hale, Moses Dunbar, and the American Revolution, a new book I have yet to get into a lot of detail about. But in a different time, in a different era of American history, everyone knew about Nathan Hale. He was kind of forgotten for various reasons that we're not going to get into. But we know he was born in Coventry, Connecticut, sometime in 1755. Nathan Hale was one of the first American spies. And let's be honest about it, he wasn't a very good one. He got caught. He was a Yale University graduate. He was a school teacher. He had been part of the Boston Siege. He had participated in it in 1775 and 1776. He joins the Connecticut Regiment, quickly becomes the equivalent of a captain in that unit, and he agrees to be a part of a secret mission behind enemy lines, but he's captured and hanged in September of 1776 during the New York retreat. After the evacuation from Long Island, Washington and the Continental Army officers need reliable information, and they ask for volunteers. Nathan Hale had what he thought was some good experience. He could pose as just a civilian. You have to understand something about the time period. If you are an officer, if you are a military man, if you are wearing civilian clothes, you are a spy. It's one thing to spy in your uniform, but if you spy in your uniform, it kind of, takes away the whole spy thing because everyone will identify you from your uniform. So here you have gotten rid of your military clothing, you put on civilian clothes, but you hold a rank in the army. You're a spy. Spies or traitors, they'll be hanged. That's essentially what happened to poor Nathan Hale. It is an illegal combatant. That's technically the definition by the British and other European armies. It's not honorable also to be a spy. Well, you got to get information. Washington is going to create a big spy network. He's going to, of course, as commander of the Continental Army, he never takes a salary. He says later on, I will only be reimbursed for expenses. And a lot of the expenses are for paying for information. And that information is costly sometimes. Later on, Washington as president will say, I will not take a salary. I will only take expenses. The Congress says, oh, hell no. We got your expense bill from the American Revolution. It's going to be cheaper to pay you a salary than to actually reimburse your expenses. So that's why the president to this day gets an actual salary. So he's left behind the American lines as the American army retreats so he can get information about the British intentions on the remainder of the New York campaign, again posing as a teacher. The British and the American army battle near the northern sections of Manhattan Island at a place called Harlem Heights. You can see the Harlem Village, which is here, the northern section of Manhattan Island. They bloody the nose of the British, but it doesn't matter because the Continental Army is in full retreat. The legend of the spying mission about Nathan Hale is that he was recognized, depending on the story you listen to, by a loyalist cousin, or, ready for this, folks, Robert Rogers. Cue the dun, 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 right? Not mentioned, I don't think, in the book. Was it? No, I didn't think it was. Yeah, I don't remember. I went back to check on it. But we know his loyalties, Rogers, in the American Revolution. Nathan Hale wasn't a good spy. He talked to people about the fact that he was spying. And he talked to people about it who knew if he was a spy, they were going to turn him in. So either a loyalist cousin of Nathan Hale, thanks a lot, awkward family gatherings after that, or Robert Rogers, who befriended him in a tavern in New York, found out who he was and had him arrested. General Howe questions Nathan Hale, looks for information. There are all kinds of maps and drawings of the British defensive lines and the British schematics, we might say, dispositions maybe is a better word, of where the soldiers are. And Howe's like, okay, checkmate, we got you. He is then told in the questioning that he has a rank and position and orders the execution of Nathan Hale. This is where the legend of Nathan Hale is born. Apparently, he conducted himself very well. That's a kind way of saying he didn't blubber, cry, or say, oh, this is going to be tough on my family. Please spare me. He just got up there, was ready to be hanged, and apparently said that I only have one regret, and that is that I have one life to lose for my country. Again, it's one of those things where in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, we love these really strong patriotic tales of sacrifice. He said something along the lines like, I have a regret that I cannot live more than once because I would do it again and again. And then the noose went on him and he was either hung from a tree or put on a cart and they pulled the cart away and he died. Not a great way to actually be executed, especially after your body is left hanging for 3 days. Someone put a wooden sign around his neck where they just scribbled George Washington on it as he lay there or hang there for a while. He's in an unmarked grave somewhere. We're not even sure. His family tried to find out where his body is. And then, again, it comes to the conclusion that Nathan Hale, not a very good spy, but when we look for patriotic sacrifice in American memory, we cast back to Nathan Hale. Maybe not as much anymore, but there again, it was a pretty popular story because we're also looking for something good to talk about with the New York campaign, which is an unmitigated, for the most part, disaster. So the retreat continues all the way across the islands of New York and New Jersey. So the posts near New York and on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River fall, Fort Lee and Fort Washington. The Army is in full retreat. Watching the troops leave Fort Lee, the actual fort that was evacuated, Fort Washington was captured with all the soldiers inside it, is none other than Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine decides, and the mythology around this, of the, again, common sense fame, writes The American Crisis. The story is he had written it on a drum head, the material that you stretch across a drum, and he just scribbled some of the early thoughts about the American crisis. The famous line from it that you probably recognize, these are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. You can see a lot of parallels between the crisis and, of course, a certain poem that was written 40 years later in Baltimore by a lawyer named Francis Scott Key. It's to, again, spark the imagination about what is happening. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot. That's a direct reference to when the going's good, everyone's brave and will dig a trench and shoot and stay and die and bleed. The sunshine patriot. Summer soldier and sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country. The Army's evaporating in the retreat across New York. There are other continental armies in New York, a couple places. He's left General Lee, not any relation to the Lees of Virginia, but General Charles Lee had actually been an officer in the British Army. Charles Lee is a fascinating figure. No one goes near the guy because he has a pack of dogs around him. And he always says that later on, I get along better with dogs than humans, which is, again, not an uncommon thought by people, even today. But Charles Lee is a guy who thinks that he should be in command of the Continental Army, always second-guessing Washington. He's going to get his comeuppance later on. But the Continental Army under Washington had undergone that retreat. You can see in this map here, the direct line, the hightailing it all the way across the state of New Jersey with part of Howe's army in hot pursuit. The other development is that through the fall to now early winter months of 1776, the British Army says, okay, there's New York. We successfully moved the army in, the Continental Army retreated, and we're going to occupy New York. They occupied for the entire remainder of the war. There are other British armies, obviously, but their major headquarters for the remainder of the American Revolution is right there. Washington in early December is genuinely frustrated. He writes a letter to a relative about the army. If we don't recruit an army next year, he says, and the army's going home, by the way, the army that he is dragging across New Jersey, running only and stopping to run only when he puts the Delaware River between himself and the pursuing British forces. He doesn't recruit. That army is signed up for 1-year enlistment, meaning December 31st, 1776, the army is over. He says, if we don't recruit an army next year, this is his quote, I think the game is pretty near up. That's a reference to 1777. So Washington has to keep this going some way or another. We'll go back to the notes here. Talk about the retreat across New Jersey, covered in excruciating detail in David Hackett Fischer's Washington's Crossing. Howe was just going to be happy dispersing the Continental Army, and also throughout New Jersey, pacifying the people within the state or colony, or state, I guess as a state is accurate, he would still call it a colony. You go through and you offer amnesty to anyone who you suspect had sided with the Continental Army, a militia unit even, a temporary force that kind of appeared and went away. All your sins will be forgiven if you take the oath to king and country yet again. And a lot of people did it. It's what we would call, using a modern term in warfare, winning the hearts and minds of the American citizenry. The oath would be taken, you snuff out any pockets of resistance, and the British also engage so that they will not push people who are not involved in the revolution towards supporting the, again, folks who might sympathize with the rebellion. So Howe and his generals disperse throughout New Jersey. They occupy certain small towns across the state because Washington, look, will mop up the remainder of the Continental Army sometime in 1777. And the British decide we are not, again, ruthless here. So they develop what they call the British Rules for Plundering. You have it. Unoccupied houses, anything goes. Again, if it's someone who is loyal to the Patriot cause and they've since left, just as the Loyalists left New York in droves, you can do what you want there. Secondly, if there's resistance, you can fight back. Again, someone takes a pot shot from you, opens a second window and say, go to hell, lobster back, and fires their musket at you, it's on. You can go storm that house and do what you want. Personal items are not supposed to be taken. Yeah, I'm sure that rule was followed to the letter. And fourth, families were left food. But it didn't work out that way as far as pacifying New Jersey. There are always pockets of resistance. That's how the revolution stays alive in New Jersey. By the end of 1776, Howe has to send his army out. The headquarters is there in New York, but he disperses both British and Hessian units throughout New Jersey. And they've got to go out in force because the roads aren't safe and the wagons get attacked. And there is constant harassment. That's the story in Washington's Crossing. So we think all is lost at the end of 1776. Not exactly. General Howe chases the Continental Army into New Jersey only to retire for the winter season. That's why we see the loyalty oaths, pardons to certain residents, but he often drives the fence sitters into the New Jersey militia. You take supplies for the army. We're going to need that horse. Yeah, I'm going to need that horse because I'm a damn farmer. Sorry, we have guns and you don't, and we're taking the horse. but I never raised my hand against Great Britain. We got to commandeer supplies. Where is that going to put you politically? That might influence a decision you have, especially when you see a militia officer recruiter, someone that you know, I don't know, from your Presbyterian church in New Jersey, come around and talk to you and say, you see what they did, right? Well, it's worse. The neighbors, they had some of their things taken, their chairs. One officer used it as a command post without even asking, and they gutted the house on the way out. You want to join this militia unit now? And people might say yes, or I got family in Philadelphia, that's where I'm headed. That's a decision you might actually make. So Howe scatters encampments throughout New Jersey. No honest British upstanding soldier or officer would fight in the winter. It's just not done. So you go into a long winter encampment. He stations in a small town outside, across from Pennsylvania, called Trenton, a group of Hessians, British mercenaries who arrived in 1776. The revolution never dies, though, in New Jersey. There are pockets of resistance where they continue to snipe against the British Army and the Hessians. Washington knows that his army must do something. He's tired of retreating and losing men. There has to be something to rally around. The cause has to be supported so that those that go home might sign on for another year. And those that look around and say, it's lost, it's over, it's done with, they might come out and join the army in 1777. That's his goal. So his combative instincts take over. There he is on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River. He's probably got 3,000 soldiers. Maybe he can summon some more if it's necessary to launch an attack. But there are three goals here for Washington. First, keep the recruits in the army. Again, these soldiers, those that are still with him, hadn't gone home, had seen combat. So these are combat soldiers in New York. They didn't do very well, but the generals didn't put them in good position to do very well. So they have some experience, and it might be good to keep them around. And if we have them around for a couple more weeks, because now it's December 1776, we should use them in some form, maybe even launching an attack. Secondly, if you are able to do something militarily successful, you can turn around the entire state. There are pockets of resistance. What if the whole state rose up and became an example of the Rege Militaire that had once brought thousands outside of Boston in 1775? Third, it will give Congress and the citizenry a much-needed morale boost after a tough year. Washington's army now sits on the Pennsylvania side of the river, the Delaware River. At Christmas night, he's ready to cross. He lets a spy slip back to a Hessian encampment to purposely describe the ragged state of the Continental Army. He says, tell this guy, this is a spy that he is employing. And he knows their loyalties are to the Patriot side. He tells them, go over and tell Colonel Rahl, the commander of the Hessian soldiers, it's pretty bad over there. And when Rahl recognizes that, this mythology around the battles of Trenton and the Christmas crossing in 1776, along with that damn painting that isn't at all accurate, but I'll put it up here to show it to you as we kind of conclude the events of 1776, that the Hessians are drunk. They're not prepared. They're overslept. You have to understand something about, and this is made clear in Fisher's book, the Hessians are on high alert. They've been harassed. They've been sent out, not in squad, but larger force, just to get food, forage, and protect the supply wagons as they're coming in and out of Trenton. So this idea that they're all, again, intoxicated, they can't find their guns. I mean, they don't know where the uniforms are. They're just singing German. That is not at all true. Yeah. This is Howe's war of posts, deploying different places, elements of the army just to secure New Jersey, while the bulk of the British Army stays in New York. In the commander's pocket, Washington's pocket, he's seen later on scribbling just on pieces of paper, and they fall under his desk. Someone picked it up later, and it was the call sign that he agreed on to have the sentries and soldiers know when they're moving from one area to another. Victory or death. So Washington launches the army across the Delaware River. It looks nothing like this. Guess what happens if you put that many people on a boat? It sinks quickly. By the way, the gentleman standing behind Washington is supposed to be with the flag, James Monroe, future president of the United States. He was actually there, as was Hamilton. This is a German artist, Emanuel Lutze, who paints this, and this is the Rhine River. It's not the Delaware River. It looked like this. This is Don Troiani's interpretation of it. You can see that the ropes were put in, and you would have just used a pulley system. And these are Durham boats. They carry grain from Pennsylvania to New Jersey, the breadbasket colonies. And this is what it was snowing. There were giant chunks of ice. There were sheets of ice where the river had started to freeze. So Washington deploys the army at the Battle of Trenton, and they catch the Hessians by surprise. Yes, they did. Yes, they did. They were ready for anything. Also, there was a story of the the Hessian commander getting another spy to come in, this one loyal to the British. And he takes this message and he puts it inside his pocket on the night of the attack because he's involved in a very apparently high stakes card game. Colonel Rahl is one of the casualties. He dies of his wounds the next day. That message still not sealed, the seal not broken on it. And literally they open it because they look for on him just any information. And it's the note from the loyalist spy that said, Washington, his army's on the move, they've crossed the river. He never opened up that. I mean, and it was an overwhelming success. Washington captures about 900 Hessians there. And of course, Washington retires with his army, just wrapping this up fairly quickly. They move on to also capture the small town of Princeton. The Battle of Trenton had woken up this sleeping giant. Well, Howe hears about it and says, oh, come on, really? I didn't even know. I thought the army was done for. And he sends one of his most aggressive commanders, Charles Cornwallis, who Delaware River. It's Cornwallis who makes the famous claim, I'll bag the fox. That's what they call Washington. I'll bag the fox in the morning. So what Washington does is has his army dig in near the Assunpink Creek near again, kind of a small water off the Delaware. And he moves his entire army by night out of that area where they're cornered. He literally, as part of his army, light these tremendous bonfires and just kind of bang shovels together. And then sometimes, you know, the British are looking across their lines and they're seeing like dirt just flying up. They're like, oh, they're digging in. We'll get them tomorrow. And it's only a few soldiers who are just banging the shovels and entrenchments and bonfires. And then the whole army move around and they hit the small British force at Princeton. This is January 3rd, 1777, because he had got enough of the soldiers to stay on past the new year. They line up and they attack the British force. And then literally right after this little battle, Hamilton is there. He's at Trenton and he's at Princeton. His artillery command actually fires cannon at Nassau Hall, College of New Jersey. It's now called Princeton University. I heard it's a decent school. Anyway, you can still see where the cannonballs had hit and impacted Nassau Hall on the campus to this day. And then Washington hightails it with the army to the highlands of New Jersey. Yeah, there are mountains in New Jersey, hills in northern New Jersey. So he's there. The army's in the other. British army is across in New York. And again, it allows and shows this campaign that the Continentals can fight, maybe, in equal terms with the British. It also went hand in hand with another bitter truth that the American populace sometimes would fail to support the war. And so that's what Washington was going to have to deal with next time. Again, it's the principle of, in 1777, we often call it the year of the 3 sevens or the year of the hangman. So we're going to pick that story up next time. Washington is also thinking about the idea of possibly changing the strategy from, number one, engage the British, which he always wants to do, to really adopting the so-called war of posts. We'll talk about his overall strategy. You're going to listen to a podcast on the British strategy as we move into 1777. What are their war aims after failing to annihilate the Continental Army and occupy New York? Revolution didn't end, but now they're going to take it directly to New England, hopefully they think in 1777. So that's the story where you'll pick it up. And then again, we'll talk about British efforts put into place. And then they're going to move obviously on Pennsylvania sometime in 1777. These winter encampments often last for not weeks, but months. I mean, like November to March, because the roads aren't passable. And it's like, oh, the snow melted. So what? If it's slush and mush, you can't move an army and your wagons and all your forage and everything else you need. So these podcasts will pick up the Forage War of 1776 and 7, talk about the British strategy, and there's a separate one on prisoners of war, which is often a forgotten element of how awful it was for prisoners on both sides during this conflict. Okay, stop the recording. We will see everybody next